As I said, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tim Richards. I'm the Technical Services Manager of the Managing General Agents Association. And on behalf of the MGAA, I'd like to welcome you to our briefing this afternoon. This is being delivered by LexisNexis Risk Solutions on the subject of climate change, the increasing risks, and how geospatial data intelligence can inform MGAs. Before I introduce our presenter, I'd just like to run through a few housekeeping points, if I may. So please ensure your microphone and camera are turned off. If you'd like to ask a question, feel free to use the chat button at the bottom of your screen. Time allowing, these will be asked and answered at the end of the event. If we run out of time, questions will be answered post-event. This presentation is accredited for CPD points if relevant to your ongoing professional development programme. This briefing is being recorded, and a link to the recording will be issued post-event together with our feedback survey. Please take the time to complete our survey, which will take no longer than 2 minutes. This does allow us to deliver the best possible future events to our membership. So today's briefing is on the subject of climate change, the increasing risks, and how geospatial data intelligence can inform MGAs from LexisNexis Risk Solutions. So let me introduce you to Heikki Vesanto. Heikki is Manager, GIS Data Science at LexisNexis Risk Solutions. He is a GIS professional with an MA with honours from the University of Glasgow in Geography and History, and an MSc in Geoinformatics from the University of Helsinki. Heikki joined LexisNexis Risk Solutions in July 2018 as GIS Data Assistant, supporting insurance clients in the UK, US and Ireland. During this time, he develops the machine learning workflow for extracting speed limits from street-level imagery. He has also worked as part of a team implementing a predictive model for the US insurance market, predicting home fire frequency and expected losses. This used the drive time to the nearest fire station, which was calculated for every property in the US to every fire station. In his current role, Heikki manages a team of data scientists working on a large variety of projects from ETL workflows to statistical modelling and innovative R&D. He has helped create a predictive model for US roof claims based on weather events, topographic data, property characteristics, and remote sensing imagery. He has also created a number of predictive models, including windstorm, based on 130 years of storm data, a basement indicator to detect the presence of basements in homes, and a buildings level accumulation model utilising building outlines for more accurate correlated fire risk assessment. Heikki has a passion for all things spatial, with specific interests in open source, WebGIS and remote sensing. So without further ado, enjoy the briefing, everyone, and over to you, Heikki.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Tim. And thanks for the MGAA for having me today. And thanks everyone for coming along. So today I'll be covering the impact climate change is going to have on the UK insurance industry. So as kind of Tim mentioned, my background, so we deal with all things geospatial for insurers across the UK. And in the last few years, a lot of that has had to do with climate change. So we've had a lot of questions about what impact climate change will have on the insurance sector and the world in general, and what can the insurance companies do to mitigate against that and prepare for that, and a little bit about what they can do kind of in their own day-to-day to kind of combat it as well. So as Tim mentioned, there's CPD learning objectives for this presentation as well. So we have 3 for today. So hopefully by the end of this talk, you'll be able to understand the current state of climate change in the UK, so where we are currently, and what we expect to see change over the next short while. And it is quite a short while that some of these impacts will be coming into play. Then describe the impact of climate change on the UK insurance market, listing the perils that are impacted and to what extent. So we'll be covering each peril individually to show what impacts there will be. and also be able to prepare for the future with knowledge of the expected impacts. So we'll list some of the data sources that can be used to kind of predict climate change and kind of prepare for its impacts. So I hope everyone on the call is on the same page in agreement that the climate is in fact changing. So all of the UK's 10 warmest years on record have occurred since 2002. Since 1998, the UK has also seen 6 of its 10 wettest years on record. Just this year, the UK witnessed its hottest day ever, so a day at over 40 degrees for the first time ever. And this is also very much a global issue. So Canada this year experienced its strongest and largest storm ever on record with Hurricane Fiona. Hurricane Ian just swept across Florida and up kind of into the mainland US as well. So it's one of the largest hurricanes that the US has witnessed in terms of insurance losses. And it is becoming a generally accepted fact that the climate is changing. So even in climate skeptic America, a recent study showed that 72% of people believe in global warming and 65% are worried about it. And the impacts that we've seen so far are off of 1.2 degrees of global warming so far. And this is going to get a lot worse. And people are becoming worried as they're already seeing the impacts of climate change. And that includes your customers. So people are going to be demanding action. From an insurance perspective, the climate will have a big impact. And one of these will be on claims. So just in 2019-2020, Flood Re incurred claims at a gross cost of £160 million, and that was 10 times higher than its previous year. The UK heat wave that just occurred and resulted in the hottest day also is having an impact on subsidence claims. We'll very likely see a very similar event as we did in 2018, where a particularly hot and dry summer caused a 300% spike in insurance claims. The hottest day on year also resulted in the busiest day for the London Fire Brigade since World War II, and resulted in wildfires across the UK, many resulting in property damage. Over in the US, 5 of the 10 costliest hurricane seasons in history have occurred in the last 10 years. Additionally, this year will probably be added to the list just off the back of that one hurricane, Hurricane Ian. 2017 was the costliest of all, resulting in $8 billion in single-family home claims. 2017, 18, and 2020 each resulted in over $10 billion in claims for fire in the US. And these are the 3 highest loss years on record. And we'll see increases across the perils listed, so flood, subsidence, fire, coastal erosion, and windstorm across the UK. Climate scientists model the impact of climate change based off of RCP scenarios. So these are representative concentration pathways. And this is a measure of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So it takes into account any carbon capture as well as emission reductions. Of the 4 greenhouse gas concentration scenarios, we have already missed the action for RCP 2.6. So this could have been achieved had all of the pledges from the 2016 Paris Agreement been met, but unfortunately they were not. So the current forecast from the 2022 IPCC report is that we're headed for the upper bounds of RCP 4.5. But this is only if there's going to be significant and immediate action to reduce carbon emissions. So of the 4 RCP scenarios kind of shown here, RCP 8.5, 6, and 4.5 are all very much realistic scenarios that we might end up going down. 8.5 is the current situation. So this is what we're currently doing. So this includes all current levels of mitigation of emissions. 6.0 requires us to meet the pledges on emission reductions that countries have made so far up until 2030. And 4.5 requires immediate and radical action going beyond those pledges. And this is the scenario that's going to be used across this presentation for most of the forecasts. But you have to bear in mind also that this is a very much an optimistic view, and the outcomes could be a lot worse. It's also worth mentioning that there's no good scenario. So RCP 4.5 might mean that we have a future with coral reefs, but there will still be significant impacts to our planet, and this will require adapting to and mitigating against in the short term. So far, we haven't seen any reduction in CO2 level in the atmosphere, and we haven't even seen a reduction in the rate of increase. So it's growing faster than ever. You could say that 350 parts per million is the safe level for CO2 in the atmosphere, and we're currently at 421 and still increasing. And this is despite the first UN conference on climate change, COP1, being back in 1995, and pledges dating as far as COP3 in Kyoto. COP27 just finished in Egypt last week. The IPCC say that the 2022 report will be their final one, as it's now or never to start making these changes. We need to do more to curb emissions, but we also need to prepare for the impacts that have already been set into motion. So this means increases in flood, subsidence, and other natural perils, and these will need to be mitigated for in the short term, and this is a role that the insurance industry can play a very key part in. So the best time for action would have been back in COP1, but the second best time is now. However, it's not all bad news, so there is action being taken. 195 nations did sign the Paris Climate Agreement, which was the first time every country was required to submit a plan to curb emissions. And these were some of the results that resulted from the Paris Climate Agreement. There was some backsliding along the way. So the Trump administration famously pulled out of the Paris Climate Agreement, but luckily Joe Biden brought the US back into line. And we've seen similar kind of results in political elections around the world, where just recently Bolsonaro was not re-elected in Brazil, famously not a fan of the climate or the world in general. So the UK government has pledged 100% reduction in its own emissions by 2050. And this is a target that's going to have an impact on every industry, because every industry is going to have to cut their own emissions to be able to hit this target. And it's also a target we really can't afford to miss for the sake of our planet. So let's look at detail at some of the impacts we'll see across different perils across the UK, starting with flooding. So already by 2050, we will see an additional 300,000 properties at risk from a 1 in 100 year flooding event. So this comes from our partners at Ambiental, who produce flood risk models around the world. And this is modeled under medium predictions, so assuming immediate action is taken to reduce emissions. It also assumes that there's no degradation in flood defenses, and this is despite about a third of flood defenses in England being under private control with no formal maintenance requirements. With sea level rise and increased rainfall, flood defenses will play a crucial role in preparing for and mitigating against the impacts of climate change. The UK government have pledged £5.2 billion over the next 6 years for flood defences, but that's an investment that will need to continue as the current standards will not be sufficient for the future. So properties that you have insured today that are low risk of flooding due to flood defences will not be at low risk in the future without significant improvements to defence infrastructure. Also, kind of new builds pose a particular concern. So with the demand for housing, there's been a lot of pressure to build as much as possible, understandably. But due to urban congestion and low density building, it has also led to about 75,000 new homes since 2016 being built in areas that are already at risk of flooding. And it represents about 9% of all new builds. And about a third of those are already at a high risk of flooding. And even more of those will become exposed as areas impacted by flooding continue to increase with climate change. So one of the examples that highlights this, the risk of new builds and flood defences that we've already seen is in West Yorkshire. So here we have the market town of Todmorden in the Upper Calder Valley near Manchester. So the highlighted housing estate was built in 2016. And as we can see, the development is very near a canal and a river. So historically, this would have been an industrial part of the town used for industrial purposes. So this estate built in 2016, it was then flooded in 2020 as part of Storm Kira, along with 700 other homes and 600 businesses. So Todmorden itself is no stranger to flooding. The area also experienced a 1 in 100 year flooding event in the years of 2000 and 2015. So areas are experiencing these once in a lifetime flooding events a lot more frequently, and this is projected to become a lot more widespread. The 2020 flooding was specifically due to the overtopping of existing defenses. So that means that they will either have to be upgraded to provide an adequate standard of protection, or the homes and businesses in this area will just need to prepare for this kind of flooding event to occur at roughly every 10 years. And it's a scenario we'll see repeated across the UK. A similar story, as we can see here, is with the Boat Inn in Shropshire. So this pub has been somewhat whimsically marking flood heights on its door for the last 100 years. So it's no stranger to flooding, but there has been a change in the frequency of this flooding. So they have 29 flood markers in total. So that's from the last 100 years. But 5 of them are from the last 4 years and 16 for the last 10. So the frequency is becoming a lot more frequent. And it was flooded again in February of this year. So they have now prepared for this kind of flooding frequency by installing removable doors and bar downstairs, which means that it can be moved upstairs when flooding is forecast, making it quicker to dry and recover after a flooding event so they can go back to serving their customers. But that is the solution for them. It's quicker recovery because this more frequent flooding is here to stay. So that's a similar premise to something like the Flood Rebuild Back Better program. So kind of making sure part of the insurance claim process is that you don't build to the same standard as before, you build with future flooding in mind, because this kind of flooding is going to become more frequent. Another example of increased flood risk is in Exeter in the southwest of England on the River Exe. So here we have the current flood scores just on the southwest bank. And this comes from our partners at JBA, who produce flood models around the world and are also modeling the shift in flooding due to climate change. So we can see that the southwest bank here already has mainly a medium risk of flooding. So this is the JBA defended combined score between 4 and 9 in this area. However, in just 20 years' time, the whole southwest bank of the River Exe will be at a very high risk of flooding. And for this reason, for this area, the reason for this is the flood defenses that are in place. So the current flood defenses are a 1 in 100 year flood defense, and it will no longer be adequate by the year 2040 to kind of deal with the amount of rainfall that the area will regularly be projected to get. We can see here that the 1 in 200 year flood defenses have fared a lot better, with much smaller increases. So the flood defenses in this area need to be upgraded just to maintain the same level of protection. And this is the impact under RCP 4.5 in just 20 years' time. So this is the medium or optimistic scenario, and this could be a lot worse depending on the action that's taken. One of the main drivers in increased flood is the shift in rainfall patterns in the UK. So here we see the projected difference in rainfall in just 10 years' time. So we will see drier summers and wetter winters. The overall amount of rainfall will actually drop in parts of the country, but the extremes will become more frequent and more extreme. So the daily rainfall rates are expected to increase by 7%, with severe downpour events increasing by 14%. And these are the kind of rainfall events that cause surface water flooding and flash flooding that we've seen already in the UK. So this is the scenario that we saw last year in London. So these are some images from the flooding event in last July in London, where we saw this exact kind of heavy downpour event that's forecasted to become more common. And it wasn't just traditional surface water flooding that can be predicted with surface water flood scores, but also the backing up of the sewer system. So across urban areas everywhere, we've seen a decrease in permeable surfaces from increases in population and urbanization. And in London, that meant that the Victorian era infrastructure just couldn't cope with the increased amount of rainfall. So the overloaded drainage system caused pipes to back up into properties with basements, causing major losses of stock, business interruption, and water damage. And this risk is increasing as well. So particularly in London. Over the last 10 years, we've seen 5,000 new basements excavated in London alone. So that further decreases permeability and also increases other risks like subsidence for neighboring properties. And this type of flooding event will become more common as we see that shift in rainfall patterns. The change in rainfall patterns will also have knock-on impacts on other perils, for example, subsidence. So subsidence in the UK is primarily driven by the shrink-swell cycle in clay-rich soils. So in the wetter winter months, they swell up and expand. Then during the dry summer periods, they contract. And both of these factors will be exacerbated by climate change. So we will see wetter winters and drier summers. So the 300% surge in claims that we saw in 2018, when we had this exact mix of a wetter than average winter and warmer summer, will become a regular occurrence, as we'll probably also see from this year's claiming events based on the very dry summer that occurred. So currently the areas at risk in the UK are the clay-rich soils of the southeast of England. So this is where you have clay-rich soils which are susceptible to this shrink-swell cycle, but also where the weather patterns kind of are able to drive this shrink-swell cycle already. However, the areas that are impacted are going to increase significantly. So by 2050, we will see the area where subsidence risk is probable will double. So it'll particularly extend further north and west. And by 2080, it'll double again. So with much of the south now being impacted and at a much higher risk. And the areas impacted by subsidence will be extending further north. So we'll also see areas like Oxford, Cambridge, Peterborough at a much higher risk compared to the present day. Also areas like Nottingham that currently would be at very low risk of subsidence will start to become impacted. Also, the areas that are currently impacted by subsidence will see more extreme cases. So in places like London, where around 20% of properties are currently at risk of subsidence, that will increase to over 50% by 2080 already. The change in rainfall patterns will also, and the change in temperature will also see other impacts. So for example, with fire, so we will see some significant shifts in fire risk across the UK. So already we saw one day at over 40 degrees centigrade, and that resulted in the London Fire Brigade having the busiest day since World War II, with hundreds of fires across the city. So the unprecedented weather meant firefighters dealt with more than 1,000 incidents and took 2,500 calls. And this was the impact from just one day over 40 degrees. And this is an event that will become a regular occurrence in most summers for the UK. The largest fire pictured here was in Dartford, just south of the Thames, but there are also fires in Dagenham and Wennington, which destroyed over 30 homes in total. And we'll see this across in other parts of the UK as well. So we have seen, particularly in recent years, big upticks in the areas burnt across the UK and the number of fires, with 2022 being the worst for the number of fires so far. So wildfire may become a much bigger cause of loss in the future as the climate warms. Certainly a much bigger risk than it is today. Climate change will also drive an increase in windstorm activity over the UK. So we will see increases in frequency that we've already seen in recent years. So the ABI estimates that that future insured losses are expected to increase by about 18% over the next 100 years. So here we have the frequency of storms. So seen here in red, so that's the number of storms that have hit the UK. And this is what we're expecting to see increase over the next few years due to climate change. The overall severity of the storms seen here in blue is likely to remain the same. So what we're going to see is more storms, but they will remain as powerful as before. So that means that if we have a look at historic trends for windstorm activity, it can be a very powerful indicator of seeing what areas are more exposed and will kind of continue to remain more exposed. So understanding previous storm trends, specifically over a long period of time, can provide very valuable insights into the areas of the UK that are vulnerable to high wind speeds. So this shows the maximum gust speed for the last 50 years of windstorm activity. So the areas marked in red are at higher risk, and these are the areas that will continue to increase in risk as the amount of storms hitting the UK continues to increase. So sea level rise is currently in line with RCP 4.5 predictions. So we've seen an average increase of about 10 centimeters in the past 20 years. So the baseline increase is not very significant for most of the country. However, it will increase to over 1 meter in parts of the country by 2100, especially with increases in wave heights. So the impact will also be multiplied by storm surge, with potential for the overtopping of coastal defenses. And DEFRA estimates that it doesn't take much to have quite a large impact on coastal communities. So just a 35 centimeter increase in sea level will result in a 50 to 150% increase in the overtopping of current coastal flood defenses. So this poses a particular concern to places like Hull or Great Yarmouth, which are already at risk of storm surge flooding. Sea level rise will also drive more rapid coastal erosion, further sped along by more frequent storms. So currently around 33% of the coastline is highly susceptible to erosion, and this risk will continue to increase with the impacts of climate change. So we have already seen increases in windstorm and flooding in recent years, and the potential of subsidence in the summer of 2018, and likely this year as well. And this is just the starting point. This is the impact that we've seen so far from just 1.2 degrees of warming, and we're currently on track to triple that amount. But the final warming amount really depends on the actions that we take collectively. The projections show that we will see major impacts no matter how we respond, but the sooner we act, the better we can prepare for these impacts and reduce the consequences. So next we'll look a little bit at what can be done across the insurance industry to improve these outcomes and mitigate against the impacts. So every industry will have to do their part to tackle climate change. This needs to occur because future generations depend on it. But there will also be government mandates to do this. So the government needs to hit its 100% target, or its 100% reduction in CO2 emissions target by 2050. So there's going to be pressure in the form of carbon tax, which will be impacting companies' bottom lines. But there's also going to be pressure from customers rightly worried about climate change, also from insurers who are concerned about emissions in their supply chain. And the insurance industry specifically can play a very important role due to a few factors. So one part is that the insurance industry holds about 1.8 trillion pounds in assets. So they can put pressure on how that money is invested. So target it at green initiatives, carbon capture technologies, renewable energy. Insurance companies also have large supply chains that they can encourage or require to become more sustainable. And we've seen that as well as a company, as LexisNexis. We've seen that in a lot of our bids, reducing emissions is part of the requirements for working with other companies. So examples could be repair, not replace initiatives during the claims process, or environmentally friendly replacement parts. But insurance companies can also play a part in mitigation. So if a property does flood, it doesn't get built back to the exact same standard. Rather, it gets built back with flood in mind. For example, flood barriers at the door, elevated storage for goods, stainless steel kitchen cabinets that can just be wiped down after a flood. Just like we've seen with the boat in and the steps that they've taken to prepare. Individual companies will also have to take action. So my company, LexisNexis, we've committed to a few targets to tackle our own carbon emissions. So these include net zero no later than 2040. 100% of our energy across the global business is being purchased from renewable sources. But also a key part of achieving our own carbon targets is making sure that we can track those carbon emissions. So that's part of something called the CO2 hub that we have internally. So here's a few screenshots of that. So what it does, it makes sure that it increases accountability to our internal and external stakeholders, so our employees and our customers, to show the actions that we've already taken to tackle kind of our own emissions. So you might also be able to see a slight impact of COVID on our corporate travel emissions in the lower graph there. So they have started to increase again a little bit post-pandemic, but I don't think we'll be returning to the same level of corporate travel that we had pre-COVID as well, just because of the emissions that it causes. And we've already made some good progress with a 70% reduction in scope 1 and 2 emissions since 2010. But also understanding risk is a very important step in mitigating against it. So understanding the current level of risk is the first step, and looking at the impacts. So hopefully some of the maps that you've seen in this presentation can show some of the value of visualizing perils to kind of highlight the risks that they pose. But there's also a swath of new products specifically designed to look at the changes to the climate in the years to come. So both of our flood data partners, Ambiental and JBA, now have climate change models. So these model the impacts of climate change on flooding around the world. And it's modeled using different RCP scenarios. So depending what do you think is the most likely one to occur, or kind of looking at different ones from different perspectives. And they model it also at different time ranges. So what will be the flood risk in 10 years time, in 20 years time, in 30 years time. We also have a new basement indicator, so a basement flag, which has captured over 100,000 basements in the UK. So this indicates properties are particularly vulnerable to increases in heavy rainfall events that are forecast to increase significantly. And these are all available through our MapView geospatial risk visualization tool, and can also be incorporated through an API response through our IQ platform. But please get in touch if you're interested in any of the perils listed here. So I will finally round up with a quote from Greta Thunberg from 3 years ago in Davos. So already 3 years ago, "I want you to act as you would in a crisis. I want you to act as if the house is on fire, because it is." And it's no wonder that it's Greta who is leading the charge on this issue. It's because her generation will be paying the price for climate change. But I hope you all agree that it's ours that needs to take action to start fighting this fire. So the final reminder of the CPD learning objectives for today. So understanding the current state of climate change in the UK and the expected changes to the weather. Describe some of the impacts of climate change on the UK insurance market, listing the perils that are impacted and to what extent. And also be able to prepare for the future with knowledge of expected impact, and be aware of the data sources that can help adapt to those. So thank you. I'll open it up to if there's any questions.
Thanks, Heikki. And that was a really interesting presentation. Really appreciate that. And yeah, if there are any questions, do send them through on the chat facility. Do have a couple for you already, Heikki.
Yep.
So the first of those is, can you explain a bit more about how MGAs can deal with basement risks more effectively?
Yeah, so as we've seen kind of in the last year in London with the flooding events, it's kind of areas that aren't necessarily kind of susceptible to traditional flooding events like surface water flooding that are going to be very heavily impacted by the increases in rainfall events. And particularly properties with basements are going to be particularly vulnerable. So kind of the best way to account for that is to know what properties have a basement. So if you're already capturing that, that's a good way to kind of highlight those risks, but also asking about the presence of a basement when you're underwriting a property can be a very good option. But if you don't have that already, we do have a new product that contains that information for the UK market. So it's captured over 100,000 basements across the UK.
Great, thanks, Heikki. I've got another one here as well. To what extent can live, close to real-time data be used by the insurance market to help manage events as they happen?
I think that's going to be a very important kind of thing going forward, is looking at the live flood events. So especially as more properties become more exposed to flooding, and we see a lot more properties having to be built in areas that are at flood risk, just because we're running out of areas that kind of are not at risk of flooding. So knowing when a flood event is happening or going to happen is a key step in preparing. Like we saw with the boat in, if they know that a flooding event is going to happen, they can prepare for it by removing the bar from downstairs and the doors and moving it upstairs, so they can kind of dry off a lot quicker after the event has happened. So making sure that you are able to get those live flood events can be a very important part of that. And that's something we are offering through our MapView geospatial intelligence platform. So it incorporates live flood events directly into the user interface. So you can kind of inform your kind of policy holders that a flood event is going to happen. You can maybe move your car onto higher ground, or kind of if they have flood defenses installed, make sure that they can kind of activate those as well.
Great, thanks, Heikki. I do have a couple of others. So first of all, trees are a key concern, not just in terms of subsidence, but damage caused by falling trees and branches in windstorms. How can the risks of trees be understood and mitigated?
Yeah, so while not, I guess, directly related to climate change, trees can be a very kind of exasperating factor on subsidence and windstorm, for sure. Yeah, so from a subsidence perspective, they suck the moisture out of the ground underneath a property. And if there's a big tree on one side of the property and not on the other, it does it particularly unevenly. So that makes the subsidence event usually a lot worse than it would be. And because subsidence is going to be a bigger risk, then obviously trees are going to be a bigger risk, exasperating that. Same with windstorm. Obviously, if a branch falls on a house or a tree falls on a house, that's going to be a much bigger claim than just the wind itself. So we actually have a partnership with Blue Sky, who have produced a tree model for the UK. So they've captured every single tree in the UK. So they have a point for each tree, which also captures tree height. So you'd want to produce some kind of meaningful statistics from that. So how many trees are within a dangerous kind of distance from a property, and using that at the price of at the point of quote, or kind of assessing the current level of risk. So there is data that can be used to assess that risk.
Great, thank you. And the final question at the moment, so if there are any other questions, do get them in quickly, but the final one at the moment, in your opinion, can we as insurers influence behaviours with pricing or making cover unavailable?
Yeah, I think so. Like the flood reprogram, that's tackled a little bit about making cover unavailable, where when insurance companies don't necessarily feel that it's possible to insure these properties, there does need to be some kind of collaboration to make sure that the very vulnerable properties aren't kind of completely outside of the insurance process. And you might see that becoming a bigger concern going forward as more properties are vulnerable to flooding, to subsidence, and to other perils. But I think insurers can play a very big role in that. So I live in Ireland, and we've already seen that for some insurers are offering reduced rates on insurance if you have a better energy performance certificate for your house. And I think that can be a little bit of a nudge. And one of the key factors as well in the insurance industry is that almost everybody has insurance. So you can be a kind of a communication hub for kind of driving some of this awareness with customers. So I think the insurance industry can absolutely play a very pivotal role, kind of influencing behavior.
Great, thank you. And that was the last question. No other further questions have come through. So just to say to everyone, if you do have any further questions or anything you want to feedback to either me or Heikki, Heikki's email address is on screen now, or feel free to send them through to me and I'll pass those on. So just remains for me to be seen. Thanks so much for to Heikki today for your presentation today. Been fascinating, really useful and timely, so appreciate it. And thanks also to all of you for joining us. Please don't forget to provide your feedback and do look out for forthcoming MGAA events.